Okay, so the Swedish M38 Mauser. This is a beautiful rifle. So this particular model started life as an M96. You can see that the receiver action is dated 1911, which is when the rifle was originally made, and then during the switch to carbine length rifles in the Swedish military, this one was redesignated an M38. You can tell that this is an early 1938 conversion because it's still using the straight handle, whereas the other M38s by Husqvarna have a dogleg bolt handle. I'm not sure whether the barrel has been cut down or it was a replacement barrel, but most of the other parts of this rifle, with the exception of the bolt and the sight, which is adjusted for the shorter barrel length, are original. So the receiver action, the bolt stop, the plates at the back, at the Carl Gustafs factory, they were, or the Carl Gustafs factory rather, they were very keen on having the final three numbers of the serial number etched on everything and having the Royal Crown accepting marks on everything. So yeah, it's quite easy to match most of this rifle throughout because they have the straight acceptance crowns, which is a sign of the Carl Gustafs production, and then also the final three digits of the serial number, which is found on lots of parts, including even the barrel bands. The Husqvarna parts, like the bolt and like the sight, have slightly different acceptance crowns. Their crowns are at an offset angle, and that's how you can tell that they are produced by a different factory. This rifle itself I actually got from Kurt at By Sword and Musket. He brings in rifles from the US that have basically been kept in good nick. It's, you know, an accepted fact that because there are so many gun owners in the US, there's a lot more opportunity, or a lot more chance that someone will have kept their rifles in good condition and they won't have been shot out. Whereas in the UK, you tend to find the same examples kind of circulating through the market, and people like to use them, and they get kind of, you know, beaten up and shot out. So Kurt brings these in and then polishes them up. As you can see, I mean, this bolt is from 1938 and it is gleaming. The bluing on the standard parts, 110 years old, the bluing has faded, but you know, the actual parts themselves are in immaculate condition. Still got the strong engraving, and the engraving work is beautifully done. When you compare this to the Pattern 14, the production value is so much higher. But then the Pattern 14 was built quickly and on something of a budget, because we needed rifles for the First World War. So it's the difference when you've got time in your production schedules, because you're not in a war. So, but in defence of the Pattern 14, the action is smoother and it shoots a lot better, and is a lot more accurate. So, Rule Britannia. Okay, so I'll take you through pulling this gun all apart as we've done before. And yeah, and so we'll start with not making the mistake that we made with the Pattern 14. We'll get the bolt in a position where it'll be ready to take apart after we've taken everything else apart. So, different from the Pattern 14, to take apart the Mauser bolt, we cock the rifle first, and then we put it into safe, and that will lock this top cap from firing the firing pin home and resetting. So then when we lift that and pull the bolt back, you'll see that the bolt stays in that cock position, and then we just release it with the bolt release. And similar to the P14, that means that this will now be loose to unscrew when we come to that later. So we'll pop that to one side. There are a lot of similarities with this rifle to the P14 because they're both based on Mauser actions. Another point about the high production values, where everything on the P14 is handled with flat screws, removing the furniture from the M38 is easier, well, doesn't require flat screws because it has these, I guess they're like pressure springs that hold them in place. So by depressing these with a bit of muscle, the barrel bands then just slide clean off. And again, this is a barrel band with the bayonet lug attached. And again, for the second one, a little bit of muscle to depress it, and then the barrel band slides clean off. And then to remove the top barrel cover, you need to raise your ladder sight. On the M38, the ladder sight doesn't actually function as a ladder sight because when they switched to the carbine length, the Swedish military had already identified that actually shooting beyond 600 yards just doesn't happen. So rather than having a ladder sight that lets you scale out to 1200 yards, they just have the flat sights that raise up to a 600 yard zero, because that was the realities of modern combat in the time of the Second World War. So then to move this top piece of furniture, we just pull that band back, and doing this one-handed isn't that easy, and then you lift and then turn it sideways so that it will clear your front ladder sight, and flick that back down. And that is the top furniture for the rifle removed, nice and easy. To then clear the rest of the receiver and the barrel from the stock, we do then move over to flat screws. Similar to the P14, the magazine plate can be removed, and again it is just a push button. It's a push button and then slide forward, which is easier to do if you're not trying to do it in such a way that can be filmed. Bear with me. Sorry, push button and slide backwards. And then again, very similar to the P14, you have your cartridge follower and the magazine plate, and then just a bent steel spring. So next we'll remove the trigger plate with our flathead screws. Okay, and then I find that the rifle gets a bit finicky about being separated. So again, a little bit of muscle tends to make everything drop clear. Okay, and then we have our wooden stock. This rifle still has the barrel condition disc attached to it, which is a nice touch. And again, you have your buttstock plate that has the last 3 digits of the serial number and the acceptance crowns. And again, matching serial number for the stock. Just a really beautiful piece of wood. Okay, so unlike the P14, the magazine housing can't actually be detached from the trigger plate. This is all just a solid piece. The button, similar to the P14, can be removed with a pin that just gets pushed through. Again, I've not really seen any need to remove it, and it's small pieces that there's no point risking losing, because similar to the P14, finding replacement parts for these M38s or M96s isn't easy, and it's not a desirable process to have to go through. I have been keeping an eye out for spare firing pins and that kind of thing, and yeah, as yet I haven't been able to find any. So the actual receiver is more straightforward than the P14 because the safety is part of the bolt. You don't have the safety switch as you do with the P14, so you have your trigger assembly and you have your bolt stop and then your front sight, well sorry, your rear sight and your front sight, and that's about it. So I'll start by removing the bolt stop, as it has that spiked screw, same as we encountered on the P14. And again, it has a much better ejector and retention system. This doesn't have that heavy steel spring that's holding it in place that it works against. The ejector, the spring for the ejector piece is actually the same spring for the bolt stop. So you have a lot less pressure, it comes out a lot easier, it's much less likely to break. I haven't actually been able to separate the ejector from the bolt stop housing to see exactly how it works. You can just about see where the different pieces are that you would need to kind of hammer clear from one another. It's not something that I want to get into and risk breaking, because again, I'm not a gunsmith, so I'm quite happy for that piece just to stay together. It looks clean, it works fine. Not going to worry about it any further than that. To remove the trigger mechanism is just a punch, hammer across the top here. I'll just get that lined up. It's not quite released. There we go, and then the trigger piece, the trigger plate just comes away like that. Again, similar to the P14, I haven't been able to get the pin out for this one, and again, it's not caused any problems for me, so I'm not worried about it. I've been quite happy to leave it. As I was saying about the acceptance markings being on everything, you see there's an acceptance crown on the trigger plate and there's an acceptance crown on the trigger piece itself. So the attention to detail in the acceptance of these Swedish rifles really is incredible. And that is it for what you'd want / need to take apart for the M38. Obviously there's a pin that is retaining the ladder sight, or the front, the rear sight. Because that lift's clear, I haven't found any reason to take that off, so rather than risk it and risk losing something, quite happy to leave that in place. The front sight itself is adjusted by just tapping it with a light hammer. I've been trying to find a front sight hood for it, because what I have found in the past is that this gets tapped and actually it knocks the zero off, and you just, when you go out to shoot the rifle, you just end up having to re-zero again. Similar to the Pattern 14, I've used it to knock down SART targets, so 4 foot by 2 foot and 2 foot by 2 foot at 550 yards. It's not as easy as with the Pattern 14, but once you work out the adjustments, the sight, the rear sight raising is in metric, so these are in meters rather than yards. But once you work out your holds, it is consistent, and it will hit those 2 foot by 2 foot targets consistently at 550 yards. So yeah, it's not a bad rifle by any measure, but the Pattern 14 is just easier to shoot. So that's it for the main receiver. Taking the bolt apart is very similar to the Pattern 14. So we've got it locked into place here, and that will allow us to unscrew and pull out our firing pin. I'll zoom you in now just to see what I'm doing with this section a little bit closer. So again, take our firing pin block so that we don't damage our firing pin. I don't know if you'll be able to tell, but you can see there is a slight bend in the firing pin for this gun. So we take the pressure off the tip of that firing pin and we put it through the thicker portion of the pin, and then with some muscle we depress the body of the bolt, turn that top cap exactly the same as with the Pattern 14, so that we remove it from the square edge and it just lifts clear, and then we can release that spring tension and let the bolt up. And then we have our firing pin with the firing pin tip nicely insulated from all that pressure that we had to put through it. Quite a bit of grease on there, just wipe some of that off. So that's the firing pin separated, and again, like with the Pattern 14, this is a solid piece of steel, and to remove the ejector, you are turning it full past the recess that it slides in, lifting slightly, and then just pushing up. And then you just push it all the way up to push it clear. Now, what you will find, which is different to the Pattern 14, is that these clips are more widely spaced, and they're a bugger to pinch back together to slide that back on. So you can enjoy me struggling to get that back on momentarily. But solid piece of steel. Again, more acceptance marks. It feels more rugged than the Pattern 14. The Pattern 14 extractor. All of these pieces are really strong, solid steel. You have the same issue with trying to clean down inside the bolt, because this is just a solid piece. But again, filling it with some Napier and then just having the patience to kind of push things down in there and clean around and then pull them back out will ensure that you're removing any potential corrosion or parts in there that could lead to corrosion later on. So that's it for tearing down the M38. It's actually very simple in terms of the number and the complexity of the parts, and they're good, strong, solid pieces. You'll have a much harder time breaking something on a Swedish M38 than you will with a pattern 14. So if you want to get a good gun to practice on, get one of these. You can pick them up for £600-700, and they are great rifles. They shoot well. 6.5 by 55 Swedish ammunition. The PPU do it. It's available in the UK. It's definitely a great rifle. Okay, so to put this all back together, again, we'll start with our firing pin, which actually, this is a Carl Gustafs firing pin, which is interesting. So it's an original firing pin. We slide back on our firing pin spring. We ensure that our safety is in the safe position, because then when we slide it down and reattach our cap, we want it to hold up in that position that we had it before, because the clearance that provides is what allows us to just simply screw our firing pin assembly back into our bolt housing. So we'll pull that down. There we go. So again, you're matching up the squared off portion of the firing pin with the squared off insides of this cap, dropping it, kind of rotating and dropping it until it sits all the way down, and then turning it so that your this lug of the cap is in the recess of the upper portion of the bolt assembly, and then that will all just clip together. And as long as you've got your safety in position, that'll be fine. Something to be careful of, and something that I actually did to this bolt, and I had to then sand off because it actually caused an obstruction that stopped the bolt from working properly. If you have this locked open to take these apart with that safety, and you put these two sections back together so that this lug is around this position, and then you accidentally knock that safety off, the spring will release and this will fire down, and it can actually take a chunk out of your bolt housing. And like I say, I did do that with this bolt, and it took some patience and some fine sandpaper to get a nice smooth edge again, because what it was doing was blocking the upper cap of the bolt from cycling smoothly through these recesses, and it was then preventing the bolt from actually cocking. So yeah, that's just something to watch out for. To replace our extractor, again, made doubly difficult by the fact that I've got this well oiled. You are pushing together these caps, pushing together this clip so that it can slide into the recess here, and it can just take a bit of time, patience and a bit of strength just to get that to clip home. And as I said, you're going to see me struggle on this step. We might have to have our first tactical edit. Hey, there we go. Okay, so top tip, when you try to push this down, it will bend outwards. If you push it down with your thumb, you'll actually expand the recess around the clip, so it will pop back in a little bit easier. And then just push that back so it clears the edge of the bolt housing, gets it back in line with that rim, and then you've got your extractor nicely back in position. So once the extractor is back in, you can take the top portion of your bolt assembly, screw it back together, being careful not to trip that safety, so that nothing drops into position and causes any damage. As you can see, you've got that recess there with this lug, so if you trip that and it's not being held in place by the action of the rifle, that's just going to fire down and will cause damage to that recess, which then affects the rifle's ability to cock. So that's the bolt back together. Okay, so next is to put all of our pieces back onto our receiver. So we will start with the trigger assembly, which is nice and simple. So we have our spring back. Okay, so after the phone battery is finished dying, let's get back to where we were, replacing the trigger assembly. So you're ensuring that this part of the trigger plate is in that recess, tipping it over and then just applying pressure until the hole from the trigger plate matches up with the receiver. And when you've got that, the pin should just drop back into place and be able to be secured with finger pressure. You shouldn't need to hammer that back in. There we go. So that's now back in place and the trigger is functioning. Trigger is functioning and we can see that that's flush on both sides. So that's the trigger assembly back in position. We can reattach the bolt stop, and again, because this doesn't have the high tensity metal spring design the way that the pattern 14 does, that just sits in nice and gently. And then it's just a matter of ensuring that the screw, or the bolt screw, goes through the holes appropriately and can be locked down into place. Now, I wouldn't tighten that all the way through straight away. I'd secure it in place, but this metal spike at the bottom of the bolt is going to rest into the stock, and if you have that all the way down, you can find sometimes that the actual receiver assembly and barrel won't sit comfortably into the stock, and you can have some problems re-securing it. So I'd leave that slightly out for the time being, and then we'll bring the stock back in. And at this point I'm just going to zoom you back out because it will make it easier to see. Okay, so we have our trigger plate with our internal magazine that's built into it, and we have our upper receiver and bolt assembly, our receiver and bolt assembly, and then we're just dropping the trigger into place and letting the whole thing fall back into the correct position under its own weight. Your barrel band here at the end of the receiver and the start of the barrel has a slot cut into the stock where it will fit into properly, so that you know that it's correctly in place. And then we're just putting our bolts back in and tightening them. And once this rear bolt is tightened, you will see it flush with the top of the receiver, just there. So they are now snugly secured. We can reattach our upper barrel cover, and again lift the ladder sight so that that can be slid in this way, turned, and will then just drop into place. So ensuring that it's under the barrel band when you try to drop it back down, and then our barrel bands secure back into the built-in springs, so there's no screws required there, they just clip on nice and easily. And then our barrel band with the bayonet lug goes onto the front end, and they just lock into place as easy as that. And then the last thing to reinsert is our magazine follower and magazine plate. So our magazine follower goes in, and then the magazine base plate hooks under the recess in the internal magazine there, and can then just be pushed down and forward, and will just click and won't be able to move, and that's how you get this back in place. Okay, and then the last thing to do is to reinsert the bolt, release the safety, and then when you decock the bolt assembly will slide back and decock fully. And then to function test, you can just pull the trigger, and that should allow you to push the bolt forward, and you don't need to strain your firing pin by cocking and dry firing to test that your trigger assembly is set correctly. Because if the trigger assembly wasn't set correctly, the bolt wouldn't be able to ride forward into battery and close without being cocked. And that is your Swedish M38/M96 back together and complete.